In order for life to have appeared spontaneously on Earth, there first had to be hundreds of millions of protein molecules of the ninth configuration.
Vincent.
But given the size of the planet Earth, do you know how long it would take for just one of these protein molecules to appear entirely by chance?
Vincent.
Roughly 10 to the 243rd power billions of years. And I find that far, far more fantastic than simply believing in a God.
That was from the movie The Ninth Configuration, written and directed by William Blatty, the same individual behind The Exorcist. Yes, why we're here can't be an accident. Whether it's due to some grand divine plan or we're cast into a prison planet enslaved by cosmic ranchers, that's the debate, and I'll leave it up to you. Those who know me know where I stand, but you stand where you best have sight into higher truths that liberate you and only you.
I want to live a real life. I don't want to dream any longer.
And regardless of where you stand, welcome so much to Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, broadcast at the virtual Alexandria, that state of mind where East meets West, always through the God above God that can. I'm so glad you continue on this journey of self-discovery. Welcome, you spiritual entrepreneurs, you Johnny Cash Bodhisattvas, you modern-day Tom Sawyers. It's no accident you arrived here, as there is no accident that life was created.
Do you believe in fate, Neil?
No,
Why not?
because I don't like the idea that I'm not in control of my life.
I am Abraxas, in his meat-sack incarnation of Miel Connor, broadcasting in the lawful but frigid dystopia of Chicago. It's the Chinese year of the cock, and I know we will all crow like Abraxas as the sun of enlightenment finally rises on our lives. I am your pompatus of gnosis, that smell of nomadic colitas rising up through the air of a world gone mad.
But I don't want to go among mad people.
This whole thing is insane.
As no surprise to many of you, Gnosticism is certainly one path I advocate. At the very least, to fuel your voyage to your personal Tartarus. And Gnosis will open so many doors, regardless of your worldview. Show you providence when at first you thought they were only random accidents. As Bart Ehrman says in my book, Voices of Gnosticism, in the case of Gnosticism, Gnosis is the very basis of salvation. One comes to Gnosis by having it revealed to that person, and through that revelation is awakened from ignorance, from sleep, or from drunkenness, which are various metaphors that are used for the state of the human being before he or she received Gnosis. Once Gnosis is revealed to that person and is accepted by that person, it's ultimately the basis for integration into the world of the divine from which that person had originated. One of the essential features of Gnosis in terms of its content is that the knowledge that saves is the knowledge that the world in which we live is not the eternal world, and our innermost beings are divine and consubstantial with a divine being who is beyond the world, and ultimately is not responsible for its creation.
As long as the Matrix exists, the human race will never be free.
Let us continue with our salvation, which in a way entails our own journey into the underworlds of our traumatized ego, the fake news that is the history handed to us, and into the silent lagoons of the unconscious. What better example than that than the man himself, Jesus, and his own descent into the underworld.
Every man carries a circle of hell around his head like a halo. Every man has to go through hell to reach his paradise.
On this February, the year of our Demiurge 2017, on show number 348, I can't think of anyone better to discuss this timeless motif than our astral guest, Justin Bass, based on his book, The Battle for the Keys, Revelation 1:18 and Christ's Descent into the Underworld. Justin has a PhD from Dallas Theological Seminary in New Testament Studies and is lead pastor of the 1042 Church in Frisco, as well as professor at Dallas Christian College and Dallas Theological Seminary. I met Justin at the Buzz Belief debate last year and was moderator in his debate with Richard Carrier on the historicity of Jesus. From the moment I met him, I saw a person with a radiant divine spark, and although we don't agree on many issues, I contend he's definitely on the side of the powers of light. He's a good man in a world of so many false gods, and you'll see his scholarly acumen in our interview.
If we have souls, they are made of the love we share, undimmed by time, unbound by death.
Jesus descended into the underworld, as did Orpheus, Hercules, and Gilgamesh, among other godmen dudes. On the side of the heroines, we have Inanna, Persephone, and of course the Gnostic Sophia. Again, it's a powerful motif and one you should incorporate in your daily quests into your illusionary Facebook newsfeed and other inanities of modern culture, and in your own meditations and active imagination. Like Jungian scholar Gilles Gispel wrote, Gnosis is going through the inferno of matter and the purgatory of morals to arrive at the spiritual paradise.
A spiritual hero who has learned or found a mode of experiencing the supernormal range of human spiritual life, and then come back and communicated it.
A very important announcement. Access all Aeon Byte shows, 10 years worth with the best and brightest in Gnostic studies and Western esoterica at the Arch of the Past shows for a mere $5.99. That's it, $5.99. No contract or minimum payment. But please consider this as also a way to support this red pill cafeteria that depends solely on your support. As a bonus for members, you'll be invited to our secret Facebook group, the Inner Sanctum of Gnosis, where you can ask me any questions you want. We'll get exclusive content in the form of videos and other benefits. Just go to the godabovegod.com and join in our subscription section on the menu. Beyond that, please support this revolution of the spigot and the mind. A few shekels here and there, perhaps via PayPal or Patreon, where you pay only if I produce. So, if you pledge $1 as an example, it might cost you $4 or $5 a month, as that's the usual amount of content I create every lunar cycle. I do have an Amazon wish list, as I'm always looking for new equipment to get by. All methods of support are found at thegodabovegod.com, or just email me at miguel@thegodabovegod.com, or go to the contact tab on the menu.
Once again, things that could have been brought to my attention yesterday!
Much appreciation and plates of Barbello barbecue to those of you who support this eternal soundtrack of the counterculture on a weekly basis. I can't do it without you. We're gonna do so many wonders together and travel together into those underworlds to face great darkness, but uncover so many hidden pearls of wisdom, of Sophia, It's no accident you are alive and you have joined me on this dark odyssey. But enough of my Pandoric drivel. Let us to the interview with Justin Bass. Deeper we go into those underworlds.
Animals are innocent. Why should they suffer? Why should children suffer? Will you tell me that? Why should any baby have to suffer and die?
Why should men?
Oh, come on now. Don't try that one on me. You've got answers for it. Like pain makes people noble. And how could man be more than a talking, tennis-playing panda bear if it weren't at least for the possibility of suffering? But what about animals, Hud? Does pain make turkeys noble? Why is all of creation based on dog eat dog, and the little fish are eaten by the big fish? Animals screaming in pain. All of creation an open wound, a fucking slaughterhouse.
We've talked about that.
Not enough!
Maybe God can't interfere in our affairs.
So I've noticed.
Maybe he can't, because to do so would spoil his plan for the future. Some evolution of man and the world so unthinkably beautiful that it's worth all the pain of every suffering thing that ever lived.
I say it's spinach and to hell with it.
You're convinced that God is dead because there's evil in the world.
Correct.
Then why don't you think he's alive because of the goodness in the world?
What goodness?
Everywhere, in man.
You're committable.
If we're nothing but atoms, molecular structures no different in kind from this desk or that pen, then we ought to always be rushing irresistibly blindly toward serving our own selfish ends. So how is it that there is love in this world? I mean love as a God might love. And a man will give his life for another.
Never happened.
Of course it happens.
Give me one example.
It happens all the time.
Name one example.
This is the AM Bite interview, and with us we definitely have the pleasure of being joined by Justin Bass. How are you doing today, Justin?
Doing great, sir.
Thank you very much for coming on. So, as I always like to say, why don't we start with in the beginning? Tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey into where you are presently.
Sure. Thanks so much, Miguel, for having me on.
My pleasure.
I born and raised in Texas, of course, the greatest place on earth other than the new heavens and the new earth. And
yeah, I love Texas. I lived there a long time. Great state.
Oh, it's so good. But I guess just to summarize quickly, I came to Christ in college. What I was before that, I definitely wasn't an atheist. I grew up in a very watered down, semi-conservative type church, but definitely wasn't a believer. I like to call myself a partying pagan. Just kind of lived for myself. I was making good money. I owned a lawn service and just partying, just completely living for pleasure. And some things happened in college that really the Lord used to bring me to himself. And I just say that what gripped me early on and still really is my primary work today is just anything and everything about the historical Jesus. So I love to talk about the prophecies from the Old Testament that I believe Jesus fulfilled as the Messiah, just anything about his just beautiful life, his teachings, his miracles, crucifixion, burial, resurrection, and the explosive movement that came after him. So really the Christ events just kind of really the center of my studies, kind of the center of my belief system as well, my worldview. Kind of the unalterable bedrock from which springs really everything else I do. I'm currently a professor. I teach part-time at a seminary and also at a Bible college. And of course, as you know, I'm very much into apologetics and debating and writing and things like that. So that's just a little bit about me. I'm married, have two wonderful kids, and my wife and I were high school sweethearts. So we actually came to Christ together in college. We were partying pagans together, and then we were Christians together. So.
Wonderful, wonderful. And for the listener, where did you go to school?
I went to Southern Methodist University, SMU. That was the college where I came to know the Lord. And despite SMU, though, not because of SMU, it was definitely a godless campus. But but I got my business degree there, and then I went on to Dallas Theological Seminary and got a master's in theology there, and then got a PhD in New Testament studies right after that. So just kind of went straight through in 8 years there at DTS here in Dallas, and then right after that started teaching and pastoring a church and things like that. So.
And are you suffering because the Cowboys won't go to the Super Bowl, or what's your stance on that?
Yeah, the funny thing about me is really the only sport that I really ever followed was UFC, the Ultimate Fighting Championship. And I stopped watching that after my two favorite fighters just completely got ripped to shreds, Anderson Silva and GSP. So really no other sport do I follow, even football. I think the Super Bowl is the only sport I watch every year. And I barely watch it. I'm usually at some, Super Bowl party or something, and I barely watch it. But
right, and then you are really you are dedicated, because living in Texas, I know. Christianity is the number one religion, but football is very close.
It's very close, and people complain that I don't do any football references in my sermons, things like that. A lot of complaints over that.
Well, you're a fish out of water, but we all have our own path. So tell us, Justin, a little bit about your book. It's The Battle of the Keys, Revelation 1:18, and Christ's descent into the underworld. And it deals with an issue that many Christians take for granted, but know little bit about, mainly through the Apostles' Creed. And I know I've said it 1,000 times when I was a practicing Catholic. And that is Jesus' descent into hell. Tell us, to start with, where exactly is this descendus, and where is it found in the Bible? Yeah,
what I like, as you saw, I know, appreciate you reading the book. You and I think 5 other people have read it now. So
we'll hopefully get some more after the show.
Yeah. No, it's fun. I mean, it was my dissertation, so I didn't expect it to be a bestseller, but I really enjoyed it. I mean, it was I got some good wisdom early on from somebody when I was doing my PhD. They said, find a topic you're just interested in early on, and just write every paper you write in the coursework towards that. And so that's what I did. I was always fascinated by the "he descended into hell" phrase. And one of the first things I do in the book is I try to dispel the notion of the fact that he went to hell, that is just an actual terrible translation. And we really don't even need to blame the English. It's more the English, of course, is wrong, but the error wasn't in the translation to English. The error was originally in the Latin. And it was actually a early church father named Rufinus, and we have no idea why he did it, but for some reason he switched. This was like in the 5th century. He was the first that I could find that switched the Latin from descensus ad inferos to descensus ad inferna, and the inferna means basically hell, hellish region, and the inferos, which was the original Latin of the creedal statement, is basically Jesus descended into the lower realms of the underworld. And so inferos was more of a general term of the underworld, and inferna is more specifically what we think of when we say hell, a place of punishment, a place of torment for the wicked, a thing like that. So really, he descended into the underworld. In fact, at our church, when we would recite the Apostles' Creed, I would fix it. We would recite, "He descended into the underworld," because hell just isn't the right. No one in the early church ever, whether the Bible or early church fathers. In fact, I didn't find anybody until about I think it was like the 14th, 15th century that even posited the idea that Jesus went into the place of punishment, the place that the New Testament calls Gehenna, or the lake of fire. So that's not what the original teaching of the creed was. It was always that he, between his death and resurrection, his soul, his immaterial self, because Jesus was fully man, that his soul, his body was on earth in the tomb, and his soul went into the underworld, which the Old Testament calls Sheol, and the New Testament calls Hades. So.
And maybe for the listener to get a little bit of understanding from a Christian perspective. So what we have, even at the time of Jesus, you still had the underworld. Is this where the good souls went to rest, and there was also a place of punishment for the wicked? It wasn't like everybody was there at the time?
Yeah, what I found was specific. Just sticking with the Bible, I found it consistent that basically in the Old Testament, starting from Genesis onward, Sheol is the Hebrew word for this realm of the underworld, and basically everybody, whether you're Jacob, you're the righteous Jacob, or and he wasn't that righteous, by the way, but just he was clearly a fallen.
Yeah, he had his flaws.
We know Jacob did not deserve heaven. He did not deserve the great reputation that he has. But whether you're Jacob, clearly a man who God had saved, and he's called the God of Jacob. Whether you're Jacob or you're Korah or you're one of the Ahab, one of the wicked people of the Old Testament, everybody went to Sheol, and it wasn't clearly ever. It's never really exposited as far as the Old Testament what it looked like in the underworld. But once we get into that intertestamental time between the last book of the Old Testament, which would be Malachi, roughly around 400 BC, all the way up until the New Testament time, Jesus was born somewhere around 4 BC. During that 400 years, of course, you have a lot of writing and speculation on what it looked like in the afterlife, whether it be heaven or in the underworld. And that's when you start to get people starting to basically deduce from the fact that both the good or the saved and the unsaved went to Sheol, that there was multiple compartments there. So there's a place of punishment, and there's also a place of bliss in the underworld. And there's also another place where disobedient angels are being held, because you have some ideas about that in the Old Testament and on into the New Testament as well. So you have a place of kind of a holding place or a place of a prison for demons or fallen angels. So you have basically leading up into the New Testament times, you have all these ideas already kind of formed in specifically the Jewish mind. And so that's why I spent a chapter talking about the multiple compartments of the underworld that I think the New Testament writers assume.
And that certainly explains all the different names. Sometimes it gets confusing because you got Tartarus here, Gehenna there, Hades there, and it's like... Right. Is this all a synonym, or what is each author trying to tell us? And of course, it should be mentioned that there are 2 exceptions for going to the underworld in the Old Testament, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So you have Elijah and Enoch they're the 2 clear exceptions, and I argue that there's probably a third, and that's Moses. So God seems to have done something special with Moses. We don't know exactly. You have this mysterious phrase at the end of Deuteronomy where when it says Moses died, it says that God buried him. Basically, it actually uses the pronoun he buried him, and the he rabbis and interpreters from ancient times have always thought whoever buried him was God. I mean, the he that buried him was God. And so then you have in the New Testament, you have this mysterious discussion, this mysterious dispute that happens between Satan and the archangel Michael over the body of Moses. So there, something happened with Moses. Body and soul that I don't fully understand, but he may be also an exception. You also have Moses show up with Elijah on the Mount of Transfiguration in the New Testament.
Oh, that's Jesus. True, yeah.
And so there seems to be something with Enoch, Elijah, and Moses, but they are the only 3 exceptions. Everybody else goes to Sheol. It's not like people died and went to heaven. In the Old Testament, there's no idea of that. But I think they rightly deduced. Many of the Jewish authors in the intertestamental period, I think they rightly deduced that, Jacob and Abraham, if they're in the underworld, it's very unlikely that they're in some way being punished or something. So they must be in a place of bliss. They must be in a place of peace, but still waiting to be taken to be with their God. So that's what I argue.
Right, and that's what Christ does. He comes and he basically tells them there's a new dispensation. All the righteous souls go to heaven, and all those that aren't or haven't accepted him, they stay.
Yeah, and what I try to say what I think is very clear from the New Testament. And there's many things that are ambiguous, and what's very clear in the New Testament is that he went there. And in fact, I spend time arguing that no Christian even debated the fact that Jesus descended into the underworld until the Reformation. You didn't even have debate on this issue. This was a unanimous interpretation of the New Testament passages and writings for the first 1,500 years of the church, that Jesus did descend. Now, what he did when he went, that is kind of up in the air. I would say that's something that just needs to be argued for, and depending on how you interpret certain passages. And so I basically argue that he preached when he went there, based on 1 Peter 3. Y'all can look that up. It's verses 18 through like 21, 22. And he conquered. That's kind of the heart of my book is that he conquered basically the powers of the underworld, death and Hades, things like that. And then the other thing I argue is that he released. So he released basically the righteous dead out of what the New Testament calls Abraham's bosom, and I also think paradise is a phrase used for it. So the holding place for all the righteous dead, basically all those who had sought and believed in the true God. And he took them to heaven. So after Jesus, now that Jesus ascended into heaven with those righteous dead, everything's changed now. Those who believe in Christ, those who are saved, when they die, their souls do not go into the underworld anymore. They go into heaven to be with Christ. And that's why Paul says in the New Testament, away from the body is to be present with the Lord. And so that's one of the huge shifts, the huge changes that happened with Jesus' death and resurrection.
And it should be noted, or maybe asking you, the ancients had an interesting view of Hades, the word Hades. Basically, it's both a place and an individual. Is that the same view that the New Testament writers had about Hades?
Yeah, so you definitely have some agreement. The key agreement that I found about whether it's Sheol in the Hebrew or Hades in the Greek, this place of the dead, the underworld, is that basically no one gets out. Like everyone who dies goes there, and nobody leaves Hades. Nobody leaves Sheol. The only way someone could leave is if God, came down and rescued them. I found a few exceptions in basically some of the Greek mythology. I think there were some people that would go down, try to rescue their loved one. It was clearly some just great stories that emphasized how love conquers all kind of thing. And so there was I think that I found maybe 2 or 3 exceptions to this, of someone actually getting out, going into Hades after death, and then getting out. But there was maybe 1, maybe 2 exceptions to that. But of course, in the Greek view, yes, Hades is basically the god of the underworld. So he's the name. It's the name of the god, and it's also the name of the place. The New Testament writers, the Old Testament doesn't really assume. It definitely wouldn't call him a god, but I think the New Testament writers are definitely assuming there are some angelic type powers that are over those realms. So I do think there's some personification of Hades, like in Revelation. It talks about death and Hades, and this is one of the things with the keys, that it says Jesus took the keys from death and Hades. And so this is all, it's hard to know what, how you define things literally, how you define things metaphorically. Clearly this is metaphorical language, but what is the metaphorical language corresponding to in reality? That's real difficult things. But, the simple way to put it is that basically whatever powers had authority in this realm before Christ, now Christ has that authority. I think that's the most simple way I'd put it.
And as you mentioned, and it certainly should be noted, that's what separates Jesus from your Greco-Roman hero or godman, is that they were alive when they go to the underworld, but Jesus, he's different. He has already died.
Right. And that was the thing. I found there were some people that went into the underworld, but then they, like Hercules, I think does, and Euripides, I can't remember. There was a few others, but it's not after death. No one died, went into Hades, and then gets out of Hades on their own. And so Jesus is unique in that sense that he's the first one to kind of burst through the gates and get out of there. And also if he released the captives kind of idea, then he took people with him.
And definitely explain this one. Of course, this is a question I've read about and seen people debate. But in the Gospel of in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus tells one of the thieves that he will be in paradise on that same evening. How does that, Justin, reconcile this with Jesus' descent into Hades, especially when, let's say, compared to Matthew, as Jesus saying he will be in the grave for 3 days?
Yeah. So one of the things I argue in book, and I'm not the only one to argue this, that basically paradise, Jesus says to the thief on the cross, "Today you will be with me in paradise." And I believe that he's speaking that literally, that day, him and the thief, after they died, were in paradise. So what does that mean? This is where I think that idea, the earlier idea of Abraham's bosom, which is mentioned in Luke in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, I think paradise is synonymous with the Abraham's bosom. So it's basically the place of bliss and rest and waiting where the righteous dead are. And I think the thief is basically being given that honor to be with Christ as he enters into that realm and releases the captives. And so I think he really was with Christ, but paradise in that context is not heaven. Paradise is this righteous, the place of the righteous dead in the underworld. And Josephus is a parallel that I really argue strongly for this position in the book. I show how in his Antiquities, Josephus, who's a Jewish historian in the first century, writing around the same time as Luke would have been writing. And Josephus actually says in Hades, in the underworld, there's a place of rewards and there's a place of punishment. So he specifically, elucidates that idea that there's this double compartment in the underworld, a place for the righteous dead and a place for the wicked dead. He doesn't actually call the righteous dead place paradise, but I think that's what Luke is doing in that context. Because one of the passages that I think also clearly demonstrates that Jesus descended into Hades that very day is in Acts chapter 2. In Peter's sermon, he talks about how Jesus' soul will not be abandoned into Hades, but it will be resurrected out of there. And so you have basically the same author who wrote Luke and Acts saying on one side that on that very day he went into paradise, and on the other side he says his soul went into Hades. So either he's contradicting himself or he believes that paradise is within Hades, and that's where I went.
Beyond the Bible, Justin, isn't Jesus' descent into the underworld, it was already part of tradition in early Christian times?
Definitely. I mean, we see one of the things that's fascinating about it is it's clearly assumed even in what's known as the Apostolic Fathers. So these authors that are writing roughly between 90 AD and around 140 AD, which is overlapping with some of the New Testament writings like John and Revelation and things like that. And in some of those writings, specifically Ignatius, who was a guy that was martyred, and on his way to be martyred, he wrote 7 letters to various churches, some of the same churches that John wrote to in Revelation. He mentions the fact that Jesus descended and conquered there, and alludes to this release idea. So this idea of releasing the saints is definitely as old as Ignatius, which he's writing around 117 AD. And then again, like I said, it's unanimous. After him, you go through all the writers, and you find that they all assume that this doctrine of the descensus is true. And some of them go too far, though. You have some interesting, definitely far more mythological type expansions on it. The Gospel of Nicodemus, you probably read that. And this is where Jesus goes down, and he's interacting with all the saints, and he's talking to them. So they're kind of expounding on the idea significantly. And then you even had some of the writers like Clement of Alexandria argues that Jesus actually released Plato and Socrates, and so
wow.
So which I think would be awesome. I hope that's true, but I think they did believe in the Logos. So
that's true. Yeah.
I really am hopeful that they were some faithful pagans for what the light that they had, but most of the church rejected the idea, though, that anybody converted in the underworld. And so basically the people Jesus took out of there was only people who believed in the true God in this life. Dante does an interesting thing, though. I'm actually reading the Divine Comedy with some friends right now, and I like what Dante does. I think it's my favorite view. It's not really it's nowhere in the Bible, but it could be true. And it's this idea that people like Plato and Socrates and Virgil and basically all the kind of righteous pagans before Christ are in the underworld. So they're in what we call hell, but they're not in any type of punishment state. They're in this place called limbo. It's basically at the top of the hell region. and they are in a place of basically the Elysian fields. So Dante has them basically experiencing the heaven that they expected, but it's not as good as the Christian revelation of heaven because they just didn't know about it. So it's kind of a cool idea. But you got Socrates and Plato down there going, discussing philosophy in limbo.
And yes, your book talks about, and I don't know if it's the Gospel of Nicodemus or again Clement of Alexandria, about Jesus actually preaching to the dead down there.
Yeah, and you get that actually in 1 Peter 3, and that's a highly, of course, one of the most debated passages in the New Testament. So I don't think we should be dogmatic and build a whole case on it. But I do think though that definitely, again, it's not the right word, but I am persuaded that when it speaks about him preaching to the spirits in prison, it's referring to these angelic figures that fell, and probably referring to that time in Genesis 6 where these angelic figures rebelled against God basically and lusted after women, and they were cast down into this dungeon and held in chains. And Jesus is descended even into those regions basically of the underworld and proclaimed the gospel, proclaimed how he's victorious over all the powers and demons and evil and things like that. And so I think that's one of the things he clearly did, according to 1 Peter, preaching. And that's what I think that preaching is. I think that preaching is a proclamation of his victory, basically.
That's very interesting. I mean, I wonder if or the church father, or, well, some debate that Origen, he might have enjoyed that passage because he claimed that if even Satan repented, he could go to heaven. But of course, Origen was a universalist. Right.
Yeah, Origen. Yeah, so most of the church rejected that idea, but he was definitely one of the people that, and Clement of Alexandria, who was Origen's mentor, actually, he's the one that really pushed the idea that Christ basically, there was repentance and conversions of basically the righteous pagan in the underworld, and that's how, and even I think he's the one that even said that John the Baptist, when he died, when he was beheaded, he, in the same way he was a forerunner on earth for Jesus, he was a forerunner in Hades. So he went to Hades and basically said, all right, Jesus is coming soon. Y'all get ready. So that's an interesting idea too. But
his job never stopped even after death, huh?
Exactly.
And what about the Gospel of Peter? Doesn't that talk about the descent into the underworld?
Yeah, it's just a quick reference. It's just, again, it assumes it, which I think most of these writings, only the Gospel of Nicodemus really tries to expound and give you kind of almost like a theatrical play of what's going on. But yeah, you have the ridiculous picture of this cross, exploding out of the tomb as the women go to it. This is in the Gospel of Peter, and it flies up in the air and it speaks to them, and it basically says that Christ has preached to those who are now asleep. And so most scholars think that that's alluding to this dissensus idea. And again, that's early. Gospel of Peter is like 150 AD.
What about Paul? Does he address at all Christ's descent into the underworld?
I think he assumes it. The clearest, there's a few passages I talk about in the book on it, but talks about, the death could not hold Jesus. He was sinless and death could not hold him. And so he rose from the dead. I think that's assuming it, but the clearest place is Romans 10, verses 6 through 8. And that's where Paul's, he's basically quoting a passage from Deuteronomy that's talking about how the word of God from Moses is not far into the sea or far up in heaven that you have to get it. It's right there. And Paul basically reapplies the word to Jesus himself. And he basically says, Christ is not far from you. The gospel is not far from you. He's not in Hades, or he actually uses the word abyss, but abyss is used in a lot of places as a synonymous with the underworld, the place of the underworld. But he says he's not in the abyss, that is to bring Christ up from the dead, and he's not in heaven, that is to bring Christ down. He's right here near you. He's in your heart. You can believe if you just confess that Jesus died on the cross for your sins and rose from the dead. And so a lot of people look at that as, the purpose of that passage isn't to teach the descent, but it assumes that Jesus, it basically makes no sense unless Jesus' soul did go into the abyss before he rose from the dead. So
And tell us, Justin, about the concept of keys and specifically how it plays into Revelation or the Apocalypse of John.
Yeah, this was fascinating to me, that this idea of keys. It's mainly in that passage, Revelation 1:17 and 18, where Jesus says, I was dead, behold, I was dead, but now I'm alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys to death and Hades. And I think what I argued is that the dissensus is assumed as the background of that passage, because Jesus clearly, he has the keys now that he's risen from the dead. He didn't have the keys while he was hanging from the cross. So when did he get the keys? I mean, I think the most logical time would be between his death and resurrection. And when did he have some sort of battle with death and Hades to basically, wrestle with them and get the keys from them? And I think that's this battle imagery, again, metaphorical, hard to know exactly how that corresponds to reality, but basically that he took the authority. The keys are symbolic of the authority. He basically can shut people into the underworld and he can take people out. It's the same thing. It refers to him having the key of David in Revelation. So that means that he has the keys basically to the kingdom of God. He has the keys to the gates. He's the one who can open the gates. He's the one that can shut the gates. And the background imagery is really amazing because, if you think about Greek and Roman and Egyptian and people from all over the world that were, maybe engaging with these ideas from Revelation, every single one, I found that, just about every single one of them, when they read that passage, images of gods or angels or demons would have come into their mind, because I found that whether in the Egyptian mindset with the god Anubis, for example, the god Anubis is said in some Egyptian writings to have the key of Hades and to be in the underworld holding the keys to get in and out. And you had other Jewish writings where it had like archangels who had the keys. And then you had other writings that had other gods, or you had that Kerberos, that horrific hellish dog that I think Hercules fought with or whatever. But so all these key holders basically are in the underworld and all these different worldviews. And so it's almost as if John is saying, whatever God or angel you think of having the keys to the underworld, really Jesus has the keys. This man, Jesus of Nazareth, has the keys. And I thought that was pretty fascinating to see all the different key holders. Reminded me of Ghostbusters. Remember Ghostbusters?
Yeah.
Are you the key master?
Powerful motif. And in Revelation, obviously, death and Hades and hell at the end of time, that's completely destroyed and vanquished.
Yeah, and that's the other. So this place of, and this is a lot even within the Christian community, this is misunderstood all the time. So if someone, I think the New Testament is basically teaching that if someone dies, post Christ, if they do not believe in the gospel, if they have not trusted in Christ, if their sins are not paid for, their soul will go into this place of punishment, which is in Hades. If someone is a believer, their soul will not go into the place of bliss now in the underworld. That place is now empty. Christ has emptied that place, and instead they will go where everyone else, all the other saints are, which is in heaven with Jesus. But at the end of the world, when Jesus returns, basically the underworld, everything in the underworld will be emptied, and even the wicked dead will be resurrected. So their souls will be reunited with their bodies and resurrected and stand at the last judgment. And that's when it says that not only they who have rejected Christ will be thrown into the lake of fire, but also death and Hades. And I think that means basically not just the idea of death, there will be no more death, but also this place in the underworld will have no longer any use, and it will be itself destroyed or done away with in the lake of fire. So the lake of fire and Gehenna, I show how those are synonymous terms, and basically they represent what most people mean when they say hell. When we talk about hell, we're talking about Gehenna, we're talking about the lake of fire. These are the future eternal destiny of those who have rejected Christ. And those, basically, there's no one there yet. So there's no one in hell. There's no one in those realms, whatever you want to call them. There, according to the New Testament, no one's there yet.
Not even Satan.
Not even Satan.
So where are all the fallen angels and demons?
So the disobedient, certain disobedient angels are said to be in this place called the abyss, this underworld holding place in the underworld. And then other demons are basically allowed to roam free along with Satan, and that's why they're pictured all the time with Jesus. You got Legion, you got Satan tempting him in the desert. So he's roaring around like a lion, seeking whom he may devour. So Satan and his legions of demons, he's the head guy, and then I think he has a hierarchy, just like I think the angels have a hierarchy. I think Satan has a hierarchy, and you even have passages in the book of Daniel that give you this impression that there are demons over certain regions. So you have this prince of Persia, you have this prince of Greece, and you have these angelic beings fighting in the air. Incredible. I'd love to see a movie on that.
Yeah.
Guillermo del Toro to do a movie on that.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, Pacific Rim meets the demons or something like that.
Oh, it's amazing. So you have this real spiritual warfare type imagery, and of course that will continue until the New Testament basically says the end of that will be at Christ's return. So. Well,
this definitely wipes out centuries of Christian art and good horror movies, and, and so it looks like it looks like a lot of Christians got things wrong.
Yeah, no, I think the mythology there. Dante really is. I mean, I love the imagery of Dante, and how much exactly was he thinking this was accurate, or was he just trying to write the great the great epic it is, and it's more. He's using fiction in a lot of ways to illustrate, a lot of true theological points. But Dante is really seems to be the main, and I'd say Gospel of Nicodemus and some of these other writings in that time period. But Dante kind of led, I think, most of the West to this idea of these layers of hell, and that Satan's in hell, and there's demons right now in hell, and that kind of idea. Of course, in Dante's Inferno, in his hell, Satan's at the very bottom in this place called Cocytus, and it's this frozen lake, and Satan is frozen in the middle of it, and he's constantly devouring the great betrayers of humanity, Judas, Cassius, and Brutus. so they're constantly eating each other's heads, basically. It's pretty wicked, pretty terrible.
Yeah, it's pretty grim, but it's kind of hard to go out and tempt people and try to take over the world if you're stuck in a lake of fire. So, yeah, maybe Dante was just, like you said, he was creating a wonderful Christian myth.
I think so.
And you say that obviously in early Christian times they struggled with this, or they speculated. Has this theology been pretty consistent across history, besides people misunderstanding it?
Yeah, and then, like as I said before, the worst thing that happened with the Reformation was that some of the reformers, I guess they just thought it was too Catholic or something, but basically they reject. What's interesting is they accepted, of course, heaven. They don't deny heaven. None of the reformers deny that there's a heaven and realms in heaven, but for some reason they just completely did away with the underworld idea. And so you get a lot of reformers starting to in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. By then, in the more Protestant tradition, a vast majority of the Protestant tradition, I wouldn't say the majority, but I would say a large portion of the Protestant tradition rejects the dissensus and basically says Jesus basically went to the grave, or just, he was either they went with soul sleep. Like his soul was just asleep on the cross, or some of them would even say Jesus' soul went to be with the Father between his death and resurrection. But again, I think that really goes against kind of the main theological point and doctrine of the dissensus, because one of the main points of it is that Jesus was a man like every other human being. And so he didn't get some free pass and get to go up to be with the Father. He died like everybody else and went into the underworld. He's just unique because he burst out of there. He was able to conquer the powers there and leave. But he didn't get a free pass. He went to the underworld just like every other human being. So yeah, the reformers, in fact, John Calvin had the most interesting view that was unique. He actually said Jesus didn't descend into hell. He experienced hell on the cross. And so he agreed with he descended into hell, but he said he descended into hell in the creed meant Jesus descended into hell on the cross, meaning in his punishment for the sins of the world. So he was the first to really come up with that idea, and a lot of more Calvinist traditions have followed that. Some of the great creeds, not creeds, but like the Augsburg Confession, I think, but some of the popular confessions have continued that idea.
Do you think it has to do anything with Martin Luther having a distaste for revelation? Maybe Protestants just kind of wanted to distance themselves from that after the Reformation?
Well, you'd think that, but Luther, I found, he used the imagery of Jesus' descent all throughout his teachings and his sermons. So he gives you every impression that he believed in it. It's Calvin who really changed that idea. He did, but you're right, Luther did bash revelation for the most ridiculous reasons. I have no idea what he was talking about, because he basically says, I don't like revelation because it doesn't lift up Christ. It doesn't constantly preach Christ. I'm like, what are you talking about? have you not read this book? I mean, it's one of the most clearly showing that Jesus is deity, Jesus is God. Some of the clear seeds of the Trinity are there. I don't know what book he was reading when he wrote that, but yeah, he did bash Revelation along with James and a few other books.
Well, you can see James for the idea of faith and so forth. But yeah, Revelation's a bit weird one. Maybe he was in a bad mood. Who knows?
Yeah, I think that must have been it. Luther was interesting. He preached the gospel, but he got a lot of other things wrong.
We all do. And Justin, I had the pleasure of mediating the debate between you and Richard Carey at the Buzz Belief debate last year in Milwaukee, hosted by Mythicist Milwaukee.
Job. You did an excellent job, too.
Oh, thank you. It was a lot of fun, and there was so much information going back and forth. So I think it was a great evening, and I think everybody benefited from it. But tell us about your experience and takeaways from it.
No, I completely agree. I mean, I thought it was great experience. Still, as I think back on it, it was one of my favorite. I think I enjoyed my debate with Bart Ehrman just a little bit more, just because that was just that was many years in the making, and I was just
right.
Ehrman is just he is probably the top of the top scholars in my field. What I'm trying to focus on, and just to be able to share the stage with him and debate with him was really, really exciting. But I really loved the debate with Richard, and I was just so thankful for Mythicist Milwaukee, giving me that opportunity, flying me out there. I've joked with a lot of people here that no Christian organization has flown me out to anything to speak or anything, but an atheist organization has done that. I've had a few opportunities locally, and people paid me, of course, to speak at a conference here and there, but no one's ever flown me out. Mythicist Milwaukee is the first, so that was really amazing. And just the fact that there was, I think that they estimated, 200 people there, and we never got the exact numbers, but it did seem like there was, maybe just a handful of Christians out of vast majority atheists, and yet, everybody was a bunch of teddy bears. They were just, the nicest people, and really enjoyed getting to know them. I've kept up with a few still online, and unfortunately, I wasn't able to go back to the debate they had with Ehrman and Price. My wife and I went to Amman, Jordan, a few weeks after that, and so we weren't able to swing both trips. But I'm sure that was a great experience as well.
Yes, it was all great. Yeah, the guys at Mythicist Milwaukee do a great job, and enjoy the way they bring information to everybody. And yes, I was there at the Ehrman Price. I was the speaker, or the guy who introduced everybody. And it was a great debate. It seemed like the one big, I don't know, you want to call it ground zero, where mythicists and historicists fight, and that is that's in Paul. God, I'm drawing a blank. Brother of the Lord, in the Galatians.
Yeah.
And did you guys? I don't recall. Did you guys touch upon that?
Richard and I in our debate.
Yes, on the James, the brother of the Lord.
No, if you remember, I tried to push a little bit to talk about the historicity of Jesus, but he didn't really want to debate that issue with me that night. Not that he's in any way afraid to debate that, but it was clear that he wanted to debate just the topic we had at hand. Because you remember, I said, well, you have books back there, Richard, that are arguing this. We're going to debate this, but so we didn't get into the exact issues with historicity. I wish, and that was one of my regrets. I wish we had, because of course that's what he's mostly known for, and I feel like it's just hard to debate, the resurrection of a person with an opponent that doesn't believe he existed.
Yes. For the listener, that was the topic was on the resurrection. It was we didn't touch too much on the James, the brother of the Lord, and some of the other issues.
Yeah, and it was even more. It was on the resurrection, but it was on the documents. So do we have reliable documentary evidence for the resurrection? Basically, do we have reliable information that Jesus did rise from the dead? And I thought on that point, I did think that we got a lot of the good information out there. I thought Richard was too skeptical on a lot of it, but I thought we had a great exchange over a lot of the key evidence and a lot of the key issues there. So that was really good.
And in your own view, what would you say are maybe the two strongest scholarly arguments for the historicity of Jesus Christ? Again, I mentioned James, the brother of the Lord, seems to be a very powerful one because it maybe shows there was you might say, a very early church with a guy named James heading it who was related to Jesus.
Yeah, and the key thing with that, too, is that, you pretty much, I don't know of any dissenting scholar on Pauline studies at all that would debate the fact that Paul, is basically telling the truth in the sense of what he believed. Paul is basically an accurate, giving us an accurate account of his experience with the earliest Christians. Even Richard Carey agrees with that Paul's telling the truth in the sense that we can trust Paul. It's not like, maybe a lot of scholars doubt, for example, 2 Peter. Peter, the author there, talks about how he was on this mountain, and it's clearly a reference to the Mount of Transfiguration. Many scholars think that that's 2 Peter wasn't written by Peter, and it's written way later in the end of the first century or into the second century, and that account is not by an eyewitness, on and on. But it's very different with Paul. With Paul, it's unanimous that I can find that he did know Peter, he did know James, he did know these guys. And so what it really comes down to is, I think what the mythicist focuses on is they try to make the brother of the Lord, the brother of Jesus, not meaning Paul's not referring to a biological brother. But no one debates that Paul did know James, that he did know Peter. And what I think along with that, I'd put as the number one argument, probably one of the top arguments would be the fact that you have that independently attested in Josephus. And so what's amazing about that is you have this phrase, the brother of the Lord, James, in Paul in Galatians 1:19, but you also have it in Josephus's Antiquities, book 20. I think it's 20.200. And when you look at that, again, scholars who study Josephus, there are maybe a few dissenters, but overwhelmingly, well in the 90 percentile of scholars who study Josephus, that's not the passage of Jesus that people debate. So the one that they debate is in book 18 that deals with that testimony in Flavius, where you have all this stuff in Jesus, which I agree is there's definitely a lot of interpolations there. Josephus didn't write a lot of that. I do think Josephus did tell a little story about Jesus there, and that some scribe messed it up and added all this stuff. And whoever that scribe is, by the way, if he's in heaven, he will be beaten down badly.
He'll end up in Satan's mouth in the lake of ice.
Whoever that scribe is, he needs to be beaten down, because I want to know every single jot and tittle of what Josephus said about Jesus in that passage. That really frustrates me that he messed that up. But I do think the bare minimum, most scholars, like John P. Meyer's a great example. He's written about 4 of a 6-volume series he's writing on the historical Jesus, and in his first volume he spends a lot of time on that passage in Josephus, and he basically says Josephus definitely said something about the fact that Jesus was a miracle worker, something about the fact that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and the tribe of Christians remains unto this day. But other than that, we don't know for sure, what he said. And then, but the brother of Jesus in book 20, there's really just, among Josephus scholars, there's no debate on the fact that that's legitimate as well. And so you have that amazing independent attestation about this brother of Jesus named James from Josephus, who clearly wasn't reading Paul. And you have, of course, Paul, who knew James. And so I think that's very strong. One thing we did talk about a little bit in the debate, but we didn't talk about it really in the context of historicity, but you have these messianic pretenders. I've done a lot of research on this, and in that time period, roughly about 40 BC to around 130 AD, you have all these messianic pretenders, basically these charismatic Jewish, sometimes not, but these charismatic figures that gather disciples around them and try to revolt against Rome. They lead this revolt against Rome, and in every case, there's 14 examples I've found, and in every case, whether it's Theudas or Judas or Bar Kokhba, they basically get crushed by Rome, and the movement comes to nothing. But Jesus's movement, of course, is the one that did continue and ended up overtaking Rome, and is now the largest religion of the day. But as far as a historicity example, it's fascinating. If you look at those 14 other movements, there's no debate. Even Richard Carrier, I've talked to him, every single one of those figures behind those movements are historical figures. These guys, Theudas, nobody thinks Theudas or Judas or Bar Kokhba are made up mythical figures. But they do argue, but there's this group of people, mythicists, who argue that Jesus, who's behind the Christian movement, he's a mythical figure. I find that fishy. I don't see why Jesus would be the one exception to these 14 other. And John the Baptist is kind of in that same motif of that messianic type movement. He's another guy who had followers who ends up dying, having his head taken off. And nobody debates that John the Baptist, was a historical figure. So I find it strange to think that there was a John the Baptist, there was a Peter, there was a James, there was a Pontius Pilate, there was all these people, but there wasn't a Jesus. I find that too incredible.
And don't forget, there was a Paul. So
yeah, there was a Paul.
Moving on, you're a big movie buff. On the side of faith-based films, what would you say are maybe your top 2 or 3 or whatever movies on Christianity?
Definitely God's Not Dead. No, I'm just kidding. Definitely kidding on that one. I haven't even seen it. But
you haven't seen it? I saw it. Honestly, I didn't mind it. My wife loves these faith-based movies, so I always end up watching them. And I understand where they're coming from, and some are very inspirational.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, I'll agree with a lot of them, of course, the message and what they do. But the thing I think they're missing is what C.S. Lewis talked about, which is, you smuggle in Christianity through great art. You don't just portray Christianity in an art form, but you lose the great art part. You know what I mean? It's like Dante or any of these great, artists or writers. They were Christians, and they would write stories that clearly had an undergirding of Christianity, but they were just great art in themselves. You know what I mean? I don't approve of. I really don't like these, Christian-made films, because I just feel like the art isn't there, even though the message is right. Of course, I'm glad they're sharing the gospel, and I'm sure people are. God can use anything. But I would rather people do like what C.S. Lewis said, where you smuggle it in. He wrote the Narnia stories with that mindset. I'm just going to write great stories for children, but I'm going to smuggle in the Christian message in the story. And I think that's the best art.
Well, Tolkien wasn't a fan of Lewis. I think he didn't like his writing because he said he got too heavy on the allegory instead of just the story.
Exactly. Tolkien, yeah, to the end, Tolkien despised the Narnia stories. I think he was also a little bit jealous that Lewis wrote the Narnia stories within a few years, and it took 30, 40 years for Tolkien to write Lord of the Rings.
That's his fault, though. I mean, he took his time.
But he did. But even Tolkien said there's a great quote of him basically saying, I did not intend any of my characters or any allegory in my story, but there's no doubt with my Catholic background that my belief system is poured out into the stories of Lord of the Rings. And in fact, I'm working on a lecture on Gandalf. I think I'm so convinced when you look at the history of Gandalf, especially in the Silmarillion, and oh my goodness, it's incredible. I think that's the ultimate Christ figure in the Lord of the Rings story. The only thing that doesn't fit for Gandalf, so it's almost like Aryan a little bit, but Gandalf would have been created, but he goes back to the very beginning because he was a Maiar, which is basically second to the Anar, the highest of angelic beings, the archangel type figures. After them, in the order of being, were the Maiar, and what's his name? Sauron was a Maiar, and Gandalf was a Maiar from the very beginning, and he just has this incredible. If you go through the whole story, it's almost like the story of Christ. It's really just incredible. But I did have them on my list. I would, if we would call those a Christian films, I'd put Lord of the Rings trilogy. I'd put Narnia up there. Passion of the Christ, I do think, is the most well done. Just straight taking from the New Testament and putting it on screen. I think the Passion of the Christ is probably the best well done movie that I've ever seen. Jesus of Nazareth from 1978. If you ever
that's
seen
a great one. I love that one.
Yeah, that 6-hour movie. It's on Netflix. It's really, I still think that one's so incredible. Ben-Hur, I think there's certain scenes in Ben-Hur that just are incredible, that still move me to tears. Have you seen The Apostle with Robert Duvall?
No, actually, I missed it, and I love Robert Duvall.
The Apostle is a great one. I really like The Apostle. There's some great themes of redemption and just really good movie. Another one I wrote down that a lot of people haven't seen that someone recommended to me a long time, and I think it's just incredible. It's called 13 Conversations About One Thing.
Never heard of it.
That's a hidden gem out there. I can't even remember who stars in it, but basically what makes it so great is the movie's not a Christian movie at all, but there's a Christian that works at this place in the movie, and the way that they portray the Christian in the movie, I'm so pleased with. I feel like it really captures just a really humble, godly, Christ-like man, and they do just a great job with this guy in the movie. And so you should check that out. 13 Conversations About One Thing. And then The Mission, of course, would be up there with Robert De Niro.
Yeah, great film. I hear the new movie by Scorsese, Silence, is very powerful, but I haven't seen it yet.
I saw Hacksaw Ridge, and Hacksaw Ridge, I think, was the greatest movie of 2016. And you could almost call that a Christian film. Mel Gibson just really he lays it on pretty thick with the scripture and clear evidence that Desmond Doss, that this incredible man that saved 75 people when he was a conscientious objector. He was a Seventh-day Adventist, and he didn't carry a gun, and he ended up saving 75 soldiers. This was during World War II. Really amazing story.
Agreed. And is it for sure that Gibson is going to be doing the Resurrection of Jesus movie?
Yeah, so he did. I don't know if there was some other. There's been some articles about it, but he was on Colbert, the Late Show with Stephen Colbert recently, and he basically talked about how he's doing that. He's doing the sequel. I don't know if they're going to call it the Resurrection of the Christ, but I think that would be most appropriate. But he's basically going to do the Resurrection, and he said he's going to do the Descent as a part of it. So I'm so I'm just so excited about how he's going to do that. I think he'll do it well. I'd love to be a contributor somehow and a consultant, but I don't know how to get a hold of Mel Gibson. So let me know if you know how to get a hold of him.
We'll certainly do that, yeah, and give him a copy of your book. Yeah, like you said, and before in the interview, the special effects for this would be just amazing. I mean, it's a director's dream.
And he gave you a little taste, because you remember, he definitely alluded to it when Jesus dies on the cross in Passion of the Christ. You remember Satan is seen in this underworld type picture, and he's screaming. Remember that?
Right,
and his hoodie basically flies off. Yeah, that Mel Gibson is definitely implying with that scene, I think, the basically that he crushed the serpent's head. He defeated his death. Jesus' death defeated Satan there. I think that's the picture. So I think he could definitely expand on that, and it would be incredible. I don't know how you portray Jesus' soul in a visual format. I don't know how you do that, but if anybody can do it, he can do it. I think he's an incredible director.
Yes. Look forward to that and see how it comes out. And to end, Justin, as a pastor, what would you say are the biggest challenges in your view for the modern evangelical movement, besides not flying you out to places?
Exactly. Yeah. Somebody fly me out. I would say number one for me, because I'm just, it's just such a big part of my life, is really the loving God with all your mind side. I would say anti-intellectualism is one of the biggest challenges, and has been really for the last 70 years, putting, quote unquote evangelicals kind of on the sidelines when it comes to main issues, whether it be science or art or, just the great thinkers of today. Rarely do you think of them as an evangelical Christian or some pastor. But when you look at history, when you go back to, over the last 2,000 years, not just Christian history, but any history, I mean, the greatest thinkers, the greatest scientists, the artists, the writers, the philosophers, they were, overwhelmingly were they followers of Christ. And so I think it's just so sad that, so many Christians today who go to church all their life, and they'll never learn, they'll never read Dante's Divine Comedy. I mean, the only reason why most Christians would read Dante's Divine Comedy as if they were assigned it in college or in high school or something. Most won't go deep into doctrine. Most won't learn apologetics. Most won't learn about incredible events and people of church history. Just I see most of those things almost completely ignored in churches across the U.S. and I think that's just really sad. And I think that's a big challenge because I think when you talk about the rise of secularism, the rise of more whatever you want to call the nuns or the more secular agnostic atheists, a lot of them are learning Christianity more than most Christians, and so that's I think clearly a big challenge. One of the churches nearby, a mega church here in Dallas, actually, I heard they about 15 minutes of their sermon was viewing that cartoon movie Up. And I think, and I keep using that as an illustration. I know it's true. This isn't just hearsay, but I checked on it. But I just find that to me is a beautiful illustration of the anti-intellectualism challenge that we have. This is basically the level of learning that's going on is basically the cartoon movie Up in a Christian in the churches. Another one I would definitely emphasize, and I think Christians are getting better with this, but wedding Christianity with politics, with certain political movements, especially now in the Trump era. I think some Christians are responding to this well. Tim Keller, I think, is the greatest example of this. He's got the mega church in Manhattan in New York City, but he's got about a split of more conservative and liberal mindsets in his church, and he doesn't say, who to vote for, and he doesn't even say what political party he ascribes to. But whenever maybe a key issue comes up, if it overlaps with Christianity and politics, he will address it, of course. But I think that's the wise path for us, is to not, hitch on the band, get on the bandwagon of some political movement that in many cases I think can be anti-Christian and anti-Christian values. I think we should stand on the outside and basically point to both sides, both the Democrats and Republicans or whatever, and say, okay, that you're doing right, or that you're doing wrong, or that you're doing right. So I think that's been a big problem, is when people think of evangelical Christianity, they think of republicanism, they think of now today they're probably thinking of Trump, which is not going to be helpful either. And I would say just one other thing is the lack of Christ-like witness, just the fact that we just don't. Christians today, you don't think of Christians today like Gandhi or like a person that's living like Christ, a person that's holy. It's hard for Christians to point to their for evangelical Christians and just churches across America to point to their marriages or point to the prison system and say, look at the prisons. No one in prisons are Christian. The early church was able to do that, but today everybody in prison says they're Christian. So a holiness, I think, is lost, and I think it's because I think there's some bad theology, some incorrect putting the emphasis too much on the fact we are definitely sinners, and that's why we need Christ. But I think a lot of people might make excuses for their sin by just saying we're sinners, and of course the divorce rate is awful. Of course we're just a bunch of sinners. But there's also be holy as I am holy. There's also be perfect as my heavenly Father is perfect, even though we can't be perfect in this life or perfectly holy. But if you look at the early church, they were taking holiness very seriously. They were taking Jesus' teachings on the Sermon on the Mount seriously. And I think today we take it very flippantly in the evangelical world. So that's a few things that I think are definitely some big challenges.
Well said. But I think that's all the time we have today, Justin. I'd like to thank you very much for coming on Aeon Byte and discussing your book, The Battle for the Keys, as well as some other very interesting topics.
Thank you, sir.
lost is no